Okay, guys, we're going to continue on with forensic anthropology. Hopefully my dogs will not bark during this. They've been driving me nuts. So we'll see. Okay, so we've been through death investigation. You guys are, unfortunately aware now of what happens when a body decomposes. But when all of those processes happen out in the elements, we have other things to worry about, and that affects what an anthropologist is going to look at. Okay, so we've discussed a lot about decay and decomposition. You guys know way more than you probably want to. However, when someone dies inside of a house, a room in a house, then the place where you recover the body from, is enclosed and it's pretty small. When it's outside, then you have a whole bunch of different factors. And you'll hear about this also when you watch that body farm video that I just posted. So one of the things that happens is you're going to have, scattering by mammals, whatever mammals happen to, live in the geographical area. Now, you're not going to see things like, coyotes or dogs usually drag a torso or an entire skull, but a lot of bones are much smaller, so it could be a jawbone that's become detached due to natural decomposition, bones of the hand, smaller bones of the legs and the feet. So now, instead of having the body in one place, now your scene could potentially be huge. So that's one problem. And then also, you can see certain changes due to weather. So bones are going to be have to potentially go through freezing and drying and humidity and other environmental conditions that you wouldn't see if that body was inside a building or a house. So here are the objectives of what a forensic anthropologist is trying to do. So the biggest part of their job, and most of the time when they are called into a case, it's to identify someone. So, the remains are skeletonized and we don't know who this person is. And it could be, of course, we're talking about the criminal aspect, okay? So, homicide, but also could be accidents, or it could be a mass grave, or it could be a mass disaster, such as the Asian tsunami or a plane crash. So here are some things that the anthropologist can determine. So age. Now, if you've ever watched the show Bones, I think I've only watched one episode, and it's not because I don't like the show. It's because Zooey Deschanel drives me crazy, and I kind of want to punch her in the face. So it's more of an actor thing. Now, Kathy Reichs, who actually was the person who wrote the books behind that, is an actual working forensic anthropologist. So the character is based on a real person actually still working cases. So a lot of the science makes sense in that series. And I have to say, that one episode was the most realistic depiction of a decomposing body I've ever seen. So I think they have a really good special effects department too. But anyway, I digress. So the thing with anthropology is you don't want to get too narrow in assigning age. So you'll never hear an anthropologist in the real world say, oh, this is a 35-year-old female, or this is a 65-year-old male. They're always going to be in ranges, and sometimes those ranges are very broad. So obviously it doesn't help if the anthropologist says, oh, this is a person between the ages of 10 and 90, right? Because that's so broad, it's going to include pretty much everyone. But you'll hear them use terms like sub-adult. And what sub-adult means is it's a person under the age of 30. Obviously, if it's a child, they're able to tell that usually that it is a pediatric case. But normally it's within the ranges of about a decade, or they may say this is an adult over the age of 60. Okay, so you're not going to hear super specific age ranges from just looking at bones. Gender is pretty easy to determine, especially if you have the pelvis, because there are definite differences between male and female pelvises. If you don't have that, Potentially you could do DNA, or, there are different aspects of the bones that you could look at, but most of the time it's looking at the pelvis. So that's what we're going to talk about. Realize, however, though, it's going to be the gender that the person, their biological gender. Okay, so it's not going to, if you have a person who is transgender, who is born a male but identifies as a female, the anthropologist, all they can say is, this person is a male. So let me skip down to height. So height, not being trained as an anthropologist, I thought, oh, well, geez, you have to have the whole skeleton, right? Or you have to have the entire spinal column. Actually, that is not the case. So an anthropologist can make an approximate determination of height if they have just one long bone. So if they have just the femur, or just, the humerus, and we'll talk about that a little later. So let me address race and ancestry right now. So I put asterisks by these because these are actually the hardest to determine, and it's because there's a lot of racial mixing going on, and people have a lot of mixed heritages. So, and actually that's super healthy for a population, okay? So to get those genes all mixed up, it makes us healthier. But it's getting harder and harder to say, this is a black male, or this is strictly a Caucasian female, because there's a lot of mixing. So sometimes that can be done and approximate, if it's really clear cut, but that to me it's the hardest thing for an anthropologist to determine. Okay, pathology refers to disease. And, here we go. Hey! Okay, so pathology refers to disease, and there are certain diseases that will leave marks on the bone. So it can indicate malnutrition, things like that. We'll talk about that a little later. Manner and cause of death. So if an anthropologist is going to make a determination, it has to be something that has left marks on the bone. So a lot of causes of death relate to your organs or your blood and what we refer to as soft tissue. That's not going to leave a mark on the bone, okay? But if the person was stabbed and you have some marks from the knife that are evident on the bones, that is going to be an indication. I had mentioned before in your liberal arts question about the hyoid bone, okay? So obviously that is something where an anthropologist can help. Also, let me go back to one thing back here that I forgot to mention. One of the things too is a lot of these mammals, they have sharp teeth, and they are going to leave marks on the bone as well. But an anthropologist is really good at determining, okay, this was a tooth mark, as opposed to, this was the tip of a knife, or it was some type of sharp instrument that hit that bone. So they're really good at making those determinations as well. Just want to mention that. Okay, so I'd mentioned also earlier that anthropologists are really helpful at doing excavations of crime scenes. Okay, so if we look at this looks like a pretty straightforward, if these people were buried, it looks pretty, nefarious. We have some foul play because this person is bound, with their hands behind their back. But so if you look at this, okay, we have 3 people, but each one of those people has 206 bones. So you take that times 3, that's a lot of bones to excavate. And really the small bones of the hands and the feet, those can easily be lost. And so one of the things you'll see also in the body farm video is, the anthropologists, when they're in there, they're using little brushes and little tiny spatulas and shovels to very gently excavate these remains, because first of all, they don't want to miss anything, and they don't want to also potentially leave marks on the bone that then could be interpreted as, being a sharp instrument. So it's really important that an anthropologist be available, to a department to be able to come out and do an excavation. The last thing you want is someone who's untrained, just taking a big old garden shovel and, you know, trying to excavate remains, because that's when you're potentially going to miss things, or you're going to leave, you know, marks on the bone that could be misleading in the investigation. Okay, but this is pretty, you know, simple. At least, you know, we've got 3 people. Now let's do the excavation. Okay, now imagine if this were your scene. Okay, so this is a photograph from World War II, from the liberation of the concentration camps. And you can see, I mean, look at this gigantic trench full of bodies. You know, here's soldiers standing there, so you can kind of get an indication of what the scale is. So this is where I talked about commingling. Okay, so, you know, these people were either killed in the gas chambers, or perhaps they were, you know, shot, you know, execution style. I don't know. But you've got all of these people put into this pit where natural decomposition is going to happen. And so eventually their limbs are going to disarticulate. So you may end up with one person's leg over here, and then as, you know, the soil churns and decomposition happens, other body parts and small bones may be mixed in with other people. And then combine that, because this is genocide, a lot of these people are closely related. Okay, so man, that is a gigantic challenge to anthropologists when you're dealing with a site like that. But thankfully, you know, especially from the Central Identification Lab in Hawaii, there have been methods used for these types of excavations. Now, thankfully, in the United States, we don't see this happening with humans, but it absolutely happens in Syria and Kosovo and Guatemala and other cases where genocide is common. We do see mixed graves in veterinary cases. So that's one thing why my lecture for my veterinary forensic students is a little different, because a lot of times when law enforcement is onto a dog fighting ring, the people running the ring will shoot all those dogs or kill them, and then they all throw them in a mass grave. And then veterinary anthropologists have to come in and do that. So thankfully in the United States, you know, knock on wood, let's hope we never ever see scenes like this. So also, the anthropologist never works in a vacuum. Okay, so the person who's going to call the anthropologist in, you know, in the first place is going to be the pathologist, because the pathologist is going to say, you know what, I don't have enough soft tissue to work with. And while pathologists, you know, they're medical doctors, they're certainly trained in bones and to, you know, see fractures and breaks and things like that. Anthropologists do nothing but skeletonized remains. So an anthropologist is going to be very helpful in helping to identify and, you know, determine what happened to that person. So of course, the pathologist. They also deal a lot with the forensic entomologist, which we're going to get to in our next lecture, or our next, you know, big unit. And that is working with someone who primarily wants to use insects to help indicate when that person died. And then finally, a forensic odontologist, which is another name for forensic dentist. And that's a person who's trained specifically in teeth. Now, anthropologists can also look at teeth, but of course, dentists are more highly trained in that. And they can also be of assistance as well. So it's normally at least anthropologists, entomologists, and odontologists that are working together. That's why I included all of those disciplines in, you know, our last unit together. Okay, so like I said, the most common thing that an anthropologist is going to do is they're going to want to determine the identity of that person. So let's say, for example, we have a case where, you know, maybe someone's walking their dog and their dog smells something. They go over to investigate. Lo and behold, it's a body, and that body looks like, oh boy, pretty well skeletonized. And let's say, for just the purposes of this lecture, that the body is on the surface. Okay, so there's, you know, it's not a grave. There's no need to call in an anthropologist to do excavation. Law enforcement feels pretty confident that they can, you know, get that body into a body bag and take them into, you know, the morgue for examination. So let's say they do that. And the pathologist says, okay, this is pretty well skeletonized. I'm going to call in a forensic anthropologist. So the first thing the anthropologist does is, let's determine whether this is even bone. Okay, because, I mean, Lord, weirder things have happened. Someone throws a relic of a skeleton out in the woods. I mean, that can happen. First, they need to determine if they're in fact bone, which would mean that they are organic. Then, is it human bone or is it animal bone? And you'd be surprised how often this happens where, maybe a new homeowner finds some small bones in the backyard and they're like, oh my God, someone murdered a baby and buried a baby. And it actually ends up being, the family pet of the people who used to live there beforehand. Especially to a person who's not trained, bones can look very similar. Animal bones can look similar to human bones, especially if they're disarticulated and not altogether in an intact skeleton. Okay, actually, let me show you an example of this. So let me go back to forensic photos. Okay, so this was a case out of, Kossuth County. Here we go again. Every time someone walks in front of my house, this happens. Okay, so this was, there I am, trying to pinch the screen again. Okay, so this was actually a case from Kossuth County, which I think is in the western part of the state. I'm not sure, but it's an Iowa case. So a hunter was out and they found what they thought were 3 human hands. And when you look at them, they do look like human hands, okay? It looks like you've got, fingers over here and you've got a thumb. And so, oh my God, do we have a serial killer out taking people's hands? Where is the 4th hand? What happened to the person? So even the county medical examiner couldn't tell. And so they called in an anthropologist and lo and behold, those are bear paws. So, that could only be determined at the level of the anthropologist. So, from evolution, a lot of our bones look very similar to other species. So yeah, it's not clear cut. And that's one of the things that an anthropologist can help with. Okay, so we have whether it's human, animal, organic. Okay, then the anthropologist is going to go to those other categories of things. So possible age of the person, if possible, a general racial category, their gender, approximately how high how tall they were, anything that they can determine. So remember earlier in the lecture part 1, I talked about ways to potentially locate human remains. And it was things like ground penetrating radar, geographical information systems, those types of things, metal detectors. And I had mentioned cadaver dogs. Okay, so cadaver dogs, normally when you have a dog who's trained, they're either trained in rescue, which means that they're looking for the scent of people who are still alive, or recovery, meaning that we believe that the person is deceased and now we want to try to find their remains. And so that's what cadaver dogs do. Actually, interestingly enough, before I went into forensic science, I actually worked at a biotech company down in St. Louis called Sigma. And one of the things that we produced was a chemical called cadaverin. And if you can imagine, it was basically the essence and smell of an entire decomposing body in a couple of drops of liquid. So you can imagine how that smelled, and that was used to train cadaver dogs. From what I have learned from talking to people who actually, own these dogs, and most of the time they're volunteers. Most people don't charge for their services, which is great. But what they do is try to develop a relationship with the local medical examiner, and then they will ask the medical examiner, hey, if you have someone who's laying around in a body bag, can you put like these dog toys or a couple tennis balls in the body bag with them? And so they pick up the actual scent of human decomposition, and that is a lot of time how, that's how it's used to train these dogs, but they're pretty amazing. Cadaver dogs can also detect decomposition in water down to 150 feet below the surface. So, incredible senses of smell and very, very useful. So here are some things that are commonly found at burial sites. So when we're talking about human skeletons, of course, things that do not decompose, your hair is pretty resistant to decomposition, fingernails, teeth, skin, not in the sense that you're going to be able to look at that person and say, oh, they're Caucasian or they're Hispanic, but the skin may have mummified to the point where potentially maybe you could see tattoos or other types of markings. Everything else, now remember, so this fits into forensic anthropology because it's actual remains. And then what is found with the body fits into forensic archaeology. Okay, but absolutely, this is important because these items too, if it's clothing and it's not a natural fiber, that is going to be very, very resistant to decomposition. Jewelry, because it's metal. However, it's not a good idea to just be able to identify someone on the basis of the jewelry that they have. Certainly, people can steal other people's jewelry and have them on. The person, if this was a homicide, they could take someone else's jewelry, put someone else's wallet with the remains. So it's really important to go through actual determination of identity. Okay, and that's what I'm going to get to. But we're at 21 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. We will pick up with identification of remains in our next video. Okay, thanks very much.